It's in progress. All right. Wow, we are back here on the Cosmic Cheeto Podstack with Russ Bradburd. Russ, thank you so much for helping us inaugurate, helping me help you help me re-inaugurate the Podstack series. It's been a wild year, but we're back here in 2025, and I'm so thrilled to have you as our first guest. Um, for those of you tuning in, just starting to tune in now, because there's been an influx of subscribers, thank you all. We're going to be talking about Russ's book, Big Time. This book is big time funny. It's big time satirical. And it's just a total delight to read. Russ, like it was so cool to get to know you. The origin story of how we met is like a sweet one. I was doing a campus visit and at the university where you teach. And I didn't get a job. I went to a different university, but we stayed in touch. And you and your wife Connie are super cool, and we stayed friends. And then this book came out, and I was like, ugh, that's a
Oh,
terrible campus novel. Ugh, no, that's like my like joyful like bubby.
oh,
Oh, I love this. Like, can't wait. I am like a moth to a flame. I'm like a bear to honey with a campus novel. I love them.
yeah.
So satirical, that is, and absurdist. So yeah, this was a great read. And I know you, of course, right? But do the viewers. And so I want to introduce you and just talk a little bit about your very cool career. Russ, you have taught almost 2 decades, all told, or taught, rather coached. Coaching is like teaching, teaching is like coaching. We'll get into that. But you've coached basketball, high school, and also the D1 at two different universities. For almost 2 decades. And then you made the jump to being a creative writing professor, and then ultimately a tenured full professor, no less. And that was at New Mexico State University, for which you have recently retired. Congrats. And you, sir, are the author of multiple books, creative nonfiction and fiction, of which Big Time is the most recent, but there are memoirs, there are novels, something I'm also very excited to hear you tell us more about. But we're focused on Big Time at the very moment. So what I would love for you to do, if you could, is read a selection to us from this this sports dystopia campus novel. Give us a little bit of context before we dive in, and then take us away, Maestro.
Well, all right, great. Well, thank you. It's great to be here, Ralph, and it's good to see you again and to hear your voice. Uh, yeah, Big Time is sort of an anti-sports satire. Before your listeners tune out, there's only like one page of actual sports in the book, and the rest is sort of there's a university in trouble, and they sell their naming rights to Coors beer, and they rebrand as Coors State. So the hero of the novel, to my ear, is Layla Silliman. She's the new kid in town. It's her first academic job, and she's a poet, but she's kind of freewheeling, and she doesn't fit into academia. And her only other colleague is Layla Silliman's only other colleague is sort of a stodgy old fossil of a guy named Wilson Keats. So they're constantly bumping heads because she's teaching in a very non-traditional way, and he wants her to sort of get in line and do it, have it be more regimented like the army or something. But so the excerpt I'm going to read that we've selected is Layla's walks by his classroom between classes, and there's quite a bit of jealousy between them. Anyway, so here the so she walks by Wilson Keats's classroom. This is all from Layla Silliman's point of view, the new poet that has the dreadlocks in on the Coors State campus. There Wilson Keats was between classes, alone, sitting at a table. Asleep. What a joke, Layla thought. What a metaphor, even. The old white guy poet dead to the world. In a way, he'd been asleep for a lifetime, ruining the minds of young poets. Layla had a mischievous idea, but she'd have to work fast before any students showed up. She set her book bag down in the hallway, slipped off her sandals, and tiptoed up to Keats. Man, he was out cold. She grabbed a colored pen at the whiteboard behind him. In huge letters just above him, she wrote, Silence. Write a poem about a time when you were surprised. I will continue to sit in meditation here. Place your finished poem on my desk and exit quietly. No talking, no questions. Wilson Keats hadn't moved. She drew a crude cartoon angel above the assignment and slipped out. Students would arrive soon, and when he woke up, they would have a good laugh at his expense. Now we're back at Layla's poetry workshop. Lyndon came into the workshop with his headphones on, mumbling, "Fuck this shit." Maybe it was a rap song he was digging, and perhaps the only line like his poem. Had he been plagiarizing his own CDs? Today she'd try to get the class to discuss how Lyndon might revise. They'd move on to Sasha, DeMarco, Todd, and LaCroix. Did she save she'd saved Deshawn's and his D poem for last. I should say, Ralph, that everyone in the poetry class, there's 5 basketball players in our poetry workshop and 1 football player. And that's it. That's the only people in attendance. Once the basketball season started in early December, the players had become less obnoxious. Layla had been to a couple of games, and yes, she enjoyed basketball more than football, although she couldn't tell Sasha that. It was more interesting to see 10 guys running around practically in their underwear. Football players looked like clones, while in basketball, the athletes' personalities were apparent. The tsunami of aggression from the silver bullets on the court was startling, the way they jumped and dunked and made faces at the referees. It was closer to jazz, so freeform. Football was like the fucking army. Braverman and Mooney, these are her history professor friends, Braverman and Mooney had actually worked the first 2 basketball games before their march. Had both men been smart enough to request professional leave without pay for the rest of the quarter before going underground? She'd forgotten to ask. Lyndon plopped down across from her with his headphones on. A minute later, the other basketball players appeared in a cluster, arguing about what happened in a recent game. Sasha, the football player, arrived just behind them. Layla welcomed everyone back and said they start by considering Lyndon's poem. "Man," DeMarco said, "that's not a poem. What's wrong with you, fool?" "Let's not get personal," Layla said, "but tell us, DeMarco, why isn't it a poem?" She was relieved that she wouldn't have to shoot down Lyndon's submission all by herself. "Because it's not even trying to be art." DeMarco leaned over, jerked out Lyndon's earbuds, and said, "Man, we're analyzing your poem. Give us some respect." "I liked it," Deshawn said. "My mom says fuck this shit a lot." "I was thinking about your mom when I wrote the poem," Lyndon said. "I think about your mom all the time." Layla reminded them that the author was to remain quiet and take notes. LaCroix said, "I appreciated the angry edge of the poem, but it's not doing enough. I guess I mean it's not doing as much as it could." "Maybe," Sasha said, Sasha's from Croatia, of course. "Maybe," Sasha said, "the poem should not trap the anger behind same dull language like bad rap music." "Fuck you, Shrek," Lyndon said. "There's no such thing as bad rap music." Layla held a finger to his lips to quiet him again. Todd said the poem made him feel alienated, that he had trouble connecting to it. Then DeMarco stressed again that any poem should strive to be art, and the class had a compelling discussion about what truly constituted art. Layla was happy about that until she realized Lyndon had put his earbuds back in and probably missed the entire lively back and forth. DeMarco and LaCroix's poems were all well received by the group. The class bashed Todd's poem because it rhymed, but Layla defended the musicality of it. Sasha's poem riled up some of the group yet again. "Talk English," Deshawn said. "You're in America." "Yeah, Shrek," Lyndon said, yanking out his earbuds. "English not good enough?" Layla had saved Deshawn's poem for last. "Dude," Todd said. Todd's the only white guy on the basketball team. "Dude," Todd said, "don't you have any other letters on your keyboard besides D?" Lyndon said, "Deshawn's poem is the bomb. This is the livest shit I've ever read." Layla asked him what he liked best. "I like the rhythm of it, the way it builds and builds," Lyndon said. "I read it aloud to myself, and by page 3, man, this thing grew wings and really sang to me." "You're a fool," DeMarco said. "No personal attacks," Layla said. DeMarco took a deep breath. "The poem feels foolish to me, and it seems to be mocking the reader and possibly even mocking the instructor and the entire workshop class." "Fascinating, DeMarco," Layla said. "Go on." "Check it," DeMarco said, exasperated. "I don't see how this poem sheds light on the human condition." It means being a human is boring," Deshawn said, "like this class." "Shut up," LaCroix said. "You're the author. You have the right to remain silent." This, he said, and shook the poem at Deshawn, only sheds light on your sorry ass. Layla deliberately led the class out early, but Deshawn didn't budge. He kept shaking his head disdainfully, as though he'd been whistled for a foul he didn't deserve. Layla feared he'd get profanely aggressive after a rough and tumble workshop where his fuck this shit poem had come under intense criticism. Instead, Deshawn said he wanted to tell Layla something. He admitted he had major anger issues issued in his father's absence. Apparently, his father only came around on birthdays. You don't know what it's like, he said, growing up without a dad. That shit can make you do erratic stuff. Layla didn't correct him, didn't interrupt. She just listened and nodded. Deshawn claimed LaCroix was the only player on the team who had a father at home, and she should make a point to be empathetic about the fact that about that fact with all the basketball players. He said he was sorry for the poem he turned in, but it reflected his true feelings. Hearing Deshawn's confession and background, she did feel more compassion, and there was no need to tell him her own personal story yet, that she'd been discarded by her own dad. Instead, she dug out some father-related poems by Robert Hayden and William Carlos Williams to share, and she'd poke around for some more contemporary writers. And then Layla noticed Lyndon had left his earbuds underneath his chair. She'd returned them the next week, but when she pulled at the cord, they were plugged into his iPhone. It wasn't the right thing to do, but she turned the phone on just to see what rapper he was so obsessed with. Who was it that he'd prefer to listen to instead of her own poetry workshop? That's when she had the biggest shock of the workshop so far. Lyndon had been listening to Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, and the book was nearly finished. So what's the deal with his fitful behavior acting that way? Or wait, what was the deal with her own negative judgment of Lyndon for these last few weeks? She left the room feeling far better about the workshop, despite her exhaustion. Most of the students in Wilson Keats's class had left already, Layla noticed when she'd finished with Deshawn. Two poets remained, scribbling away at the assignment, and Keats was sitting still as a stone. One remaining poet checked her watch and bent to the ear of the other to whisper. They stood in unison, marched their papers up to the front, and placed them on a stack, then made for the exit. Good class? Layla whispered to them. Bizarro, the young woman said. Great class, the other said as they breezed past. Keats didn't say a word for once. Layla kicked off her sandals again and glided slowly to the front of the classroom. She wanted to swipe a couple of the student poems just for laughs. She kept her eyes fixed on Keats in case he should stir. Wilson Keats was the unhealthiest looking dude on the planet, pale and gray, clearly in need of some organic greens. Should she erase her writing prompt on the whiteboard? Would he know her handwriting? She crept along until she was parallel with him. His mouth was open, and he'd been drooling. A cold front of air hit her, and she hugged herself against the chill. Her breath caught in her throat. No wonder he was so still. Wilson Keats was dead.
Oof. Oh, thank you so much, Russ.
Thank you.
What I really, really love about that selection is that it is so paradigmatic of how this novel works, right? It's just this like really, I mean, I have like a nightmare workshop scene in my novel I'm working on right now, actually. But it's this like really like astutely observed, like wild kind of poetry workshop. I know I mentioned this before. Oh God, I love the dialogue. You capture the kids' dialogue so excellently. And here's Layla, kind of the flower child, white lady with dreadlocks, trying to kind of corral these kids and help them get where she wants them to go. And then, when the workshop's over with its attendant surprises, right? She thinks she's really kind of found everything out, and she has yet to find out the biggest shock of all. Keats died in his classroom. So, I think like it's a great place to start because that's how this book works, right? It just, you know, every time you think big time has really pulled the rug out from under you, things go even more sideways.
Hmm.
So I just love that. I want to first of all, I don't think we can move on without addressing the painting behind you, which I love and actually asked you to showcase more prominently, even though you offered to sit against a maybe a less loud background. But I love this painting, not just because it's like really cool and Grant Woody, and as we were saying, but also we decided that these dudes, these farmer dudes, Southwestern farmer dudes, whatever they are going to function as the kind of quasi-angel and devil on your shoulders. The guy in the blue shirt is going to be the creative inspiration. Yes, that would be him, Mr. Inspiration. And then him, whom you're gesturing to, is the editor. So I'm actually going to kind of jump my cue here, and I'm going to ask you a craft question first, and then we'll go more into the content questions. But as you're writing this, Russell, how did you, or should I say, Coach, how did you balance, the inspiration for this story, right? Which I think was kind of all around you, not in your immediate, not only in your immediate milieu, but like in your life, right? How did you balance that inspiration with Mr. Red Jacket, with the editor?
Well, I think I felt like, when I made the change, I had two very different careers, as you alluded to. And when I made the change from being a college basketball coach to being lucky enough to land a professor job pretty soon after I quit coaching, um, the difference was so shocking, and I felt like something needed to be said about it. But there's been plenty of books about the overemphasis of sports on our campuses, and it doesn't happen it doesn't happen. I went to North Park College. It's not at North Park College. It's not happening, but at University of Illinois, it is. A few years ago, the highest paid person in your state of Illinois, Ralph, was Lovie Smith. He was the former football coach at Illinois. He wasn't even coaching, but because they'd fired him, he was the highest paid state employee, and they owed him a lot of money on his contract. So, but I've just felt like people have, it's almost gotten where people don't talk about it anymore. They weren't talking about it at the faculty meetings at New Mexico State. And I've gotten where I think that humor and satire is the sort of can get at a greater truth than serious journalism can get at. So I think you might think I'm nuts, but I think I read the New York Times every day, listen to a little bit of NPR, not as much as I used to, but read the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Guardian. And I think that Colbert is a better news source, Stephen Colbert. And I think Jon Stewart's a better news source. John Oliver's a better news source. And I think you're able to get at something through comedy that you can't get at through serious fiction. But and as an asterisk to that, I think that well, the last thing any of us want from our fiction is a lecture about what's right and wrong. I think oftentimes, I think with great novels, people disagree about, about the meaning of the novel or what the point is. But I don't think anyone would read Catch-22 and say, "I'll join up and sign the army. This seems great." I think through humor, you're able to give more, not a lecture exactly, but you're able to make a point. I don't think anyone will read Big Time and think, isn't college sports on our American campus is a great thing for our universities. Anyway, long story short, I think you can make a point through comedy that it's more difficult to make through serious fiction.
Oh, certainly. Yeah. It's almost like it feels ironic, but I don't think it is, right? To suggest that the inspiration is I think this very real, very true sense. Hello, I definitely it was just a VAP for a year, but wow, did I teach at LSU, Louisiana State University, and I was aware of the Tigers. It was impossible not to be. But yeah, I think the inspiration, right, comes from this very real sense of like, my God, like Division I athletics, in particular football, is like absolutely colonizing the American university in these really damaging ways. And then it's almost like the editor, in fact, was like, I think the better way to talk about this would be satire. I completely agree with you. Like, it's not if I'm just like, oh, I'm lecturing you, don't sign up for football, right? Like, what 18-year-old is gonna be like, oh yeah, I'll totally listen to this adult lecturing me. And so I think, yeah, the comedic message, it really resonated with me, certainly.
Yeah,
Um,
and
yeah.
it started with this idea of mocking the place of football. But
Mhm.
after about my third or fourth faculty meeting, I sort of changed my the I felt the book sort of shifting where as I'm mocking the place of football and basketball on our campuses. At LSU where you used to teach, for example, I'll bet the football coach makes $5 million a year there. But if you send your kid to LSU, they're going to be taught by underpaid adjuncts that don't have health insurance for their first couple of years. They're not going to even meet the football coach. And
Yeah.
so, but as I was sitting through these faculty meetings, I've gotten where I think it's the acquiescence of the faculty and the administration, how impotent they are, and how they turn a blind eye to it all the time. I
Mhm.
remember before I ever got tenure, the provost came into our faculty meeting, and I raised my hand. I can be a bit of a troublemaker, but I raised my hand and said, what's at the time they'd used $1 million to renovate our already perfect varsity weight room. And one of the things they did, they put in 8 video cameras to count the repetitions for the players. So, you do 8 repetition and counts it for you as if the players couldn't count. And so I raised my hand and asked the provost, what is the point of building $1 million weight room when there's so many of our adjunct faculty and boy, the room got really quiet. And after that meeting, and he sort of dodged the question and changed the subject. And after the meeting, two of the people, that one was the department head and one was going to be the department head, they came up to me and boy, they really chastised me. They said, that's not what you do in a faculty meeting. You don't get to ask the provost questions like that. And I just thought, if we're never going to ask the difficult questions, so part of it for me was this sort of frustration. I'm not the I can't remember who said this, Ralph, but somebody said if the English department was on fire, half of the department would want to start a fire committee. Like rather than we better run out of the building and put the fire out, but instead it's like let's form a fire committee. So did you ever meet Robin Rahm? She was our visiting. She was only a professor at New Mexico State for a year, but she at her second faculty meeting, she raised her hand and asked. She said, "Look, I've gotten so bogged down already with committee work. Is there any way that we could do less committee work, and so I could have more time to be a writer?" And by the end of the meeting, you won't believe it, but by the end of the meeting, they'd formed a new committee to study how we could do less committee work.
Oh my
Believe,
God.
I could not believe it. And so I think
Oh,
it's one thing. I think you can get angry about it, and I was angry about it in some ways, but I just felt like making fun of the situation felt more powerful to me.
oh, absolutely. I mean, I think forming a committee, right, to deal with the excess of committee work, it's something right out of a Joseph Heller novel too. I love it. And I have lived it. It's horrifying. But this actually gets into my next question, Coach, which is, the novel, right, which I'm going to hold up again so everyone can see this cover. The novel deals with, yeah, here we go, big time, big time. The novel, as you said, right, describes a situation of this a regional university that's been essentially sold by President Cardley, whom we think we'll discuss more of him later, but sold by its president to Coors, the beer corporation. So it's known, as you said, as Coors State, and it's being restructured. There's a reorg that's going to lead to essentially football supremacy, which I love the way you capitalized it, like big F football. Like it's metonymic in the book, like football says no, football says you can't do this, and it was very Orwellian. Um, but essentially, football is in control of everything. This coach Maniscalco is like kind of giving Stalin vibes. And he's essentially the shot caller. And what happens is all these academic departments, rather than there being like a budget for English or a budget for history, well, you can help out at football games. And then what you earn helping out at football games, say, selling this like microbrew that you make, chemistry department, or like writing the programs and selling them, English department, or which English is, we'll talk about them too as well. Um, that's what you can keep, right? And those will be your salaries. So essentially, you are a remora on the stomach of big football.
Yeah,
Um,
when the novel opens, yeah, the university's been restructured, and the salaries to the faculty gets
yeah,
cut, and so half the faculty resigns, but the ones who stay, they don't rebel, they acquiesce, and they wind
yeah,
up
yes.
working for football, and so women's studies does the players' laundry, and the
God, that was devastating. Yeah,
criminal justice it
they're the
becomes campus
cops.
security and that kind of, so everybody has to work for football and basketball in order to survive.
Well, and that was so right. And my question is, where is, like any like super incisive kind of dystopian satire? It's a lot truer than I think a lot of people realize. And so my question to you, Coach, is how true is this, right? Like, how true is this dystopia? Where the lines between, the reality and the falsehoods? Like, what would you say?
Yeah, well, first I will say I was in favor. I was in favor of the players getting paid something because for a long time it was unbridled capitalism for the coaches and socialism for the players, and that was you can't have it both ways. Um, so I don't want to. I don't. But I think the situation, although I was in favor of that, you have to be careful of what you're in favor of. It's just gotten out of control where now it's not just that the football coach is higher paid than your university president at Illinois. My guess is the offensive coordinator in football, these are the assistant coaches, or defensive coordinator, the basketball coach, possibly even the assistant basketball coach is getting paid more than the president. And at the bigger schools, at Michigan and places like that, there's football players making more than the president and basketball players making more than the president. And again, I was all for particularly, money going into a lot of this is going to African American kids, which I'm totally in favor of. But I think it's, corrupt. Obviously, it's corrupted the mission of the school. And so I think, there used to be this sort of saying when I asked the provost why we had to put $1 million into the weight room, he mentioned that his phrase, and he wasn't the first one to use this, is that athletics, football and basketball in particular, not what I wind up calling in the novel the hobby sports. No, very few people care about women's sports or the smaller sports, but he said that football and basketball were sort of the front porch of the university. That's the first thing you see as you drive up to the house. But now it's gotten where, the front porch is actually bigger than the entire house. And that
Yeah,
you can hardly even see the house anymore.
right.
And it's not just the administration that's acquiesced, but it's happened. It's all through American society where people donate money for now to pay the athletes or donate money to and like at many universities, and mine is one of them. If you call them and say, listen, I want to do my last will and testament, and I want to include the university, many of them will send someone over to try to talk you to giving the money to athletics. And I think that's a really weird thing. That's a really weird thing to do. Is that they're not coming over and asking you to build a new library or to fund this poetry prize or that kind of thing. They want the money to go to athletics. And it's just gotten where, in American society today, it's just the sound bite and the glamour and the glitz is everything. And the substance is completely meaningless. So one of the things I noticed, Ralph, when I got on the academic side of things, I know in athletics, if the assistant baseball coach left, we had a new assistant baseball coach within a month. But on the academic side, like for example, in our history department at New Mexico State, we're 40 miles from the Mexican border. There hasn't been a Mexican history professor at New Mexico State in 25 years. They just keep delaying hiring this person. And this is happening particularly with the arts, the liberal arts kind of side of campuses we haven't had a Milton Scott. When I first started coming to the faculty meetings, I guess when I first started taking classes, well, I was still coaching when I was taking classes, but there were 28 English professors, and today there's 14 of them.
Yeah.
Yeah, and as things keep shrinking, what I found is that the faculty say, well, we don't want to, they just turn a blind eye. We don't want to cause problems. We don't want to, and the fear of losing your tenure or making somebody mad, or if that we were to lash out at them, it would only get worse. But it can't. I don't think it can get any worse. There's plenty of universities in America now where they're dropping English and dropping the liberal arts. It's only about what can make money for the school. And my feeling is, I imagine most of our viewers today might agree with me. Some people say, yeah, but at Michigan, football actually makes money for the university. But my feeling is, Ralph, that just because it makes money doesn't mean that it's the right thing for the university. Like I've got plenty of ideas of ways we could make money on campus that are unethical, even if they're not illegal, they might not be ethical. Like, we could sell pornography at the school bookstore. Like we could have a whole entire pornography section. But is that the mission of the university? Is that, so I do think oftentimes defenders of this system say almost no one says this is the right thing for the university. Instead, the only defense of it is, well, it makes money.
Well, so here's my next question. It's so funny. Last time we were on Zoom together, you were asking me the hard-hitting questions, and now it's my turn. Um,
Yes.
so the next question, Coach, it's
Wait, I'm not coach anymore. I haven't been coach since 2000.
your coach to me
I'm
forever.
I'm retired professor or Russ. But actually, it's funny because my closest friends still call me coach.
Well, I'm going to call you Professor Coach.
Well,
Professor Coach, so what do you think, like, this is kind of a two-parter. Basically, part one, in addition to big sports, right? What are the other sort of special interests that the American university is being mortgaged to, in your opinion? I have a friend who really aptly described a university as a hedge fund that offers some classes sometimes. I thought that was dead on. So yeah, that's part one, and then I'll
well,
ask you part two.
I would be guessing on this, Ralph. I'm not sure. My understanding is that oil companies are often funding engineering departments and that kind of. But I think that happens all through. It's not just the universities. Like if you go to the New York Times today, and there will be a dozen new articles today about sports and one about the environment. Like why is there not the U.S. and then you go to the USA Today and there's four sections. There's life, news, money and sports. Like money and sports are the two of the, half of the newspaper in the USA Today. Like to my, I'm big on environmental stuff. Like we can argue all we want about abortion rights, but if we can't breathe, you know, there, but to my ear, it's happened all through American society. It's not just the universities, but I don't really know who's funding what at universities, but because it's dollar driven, because it's the donors that are funding this. And that's why oftentimes, like when Lovie Smith got fired at Illinois, that wasn't something the athletic director wanted to do. That came from the boosters. We're not giving money anymore unless you get rid of this guy.
It's the
And,
top.
yeah,
Yeah.
and that's what's driving it. And what I think will happen now is it's going to get more volatile because there's a new rule, Ruff. You're probably aware. It's called name, image, and likeness. It's called NIL. I started writing the novel well before the name, image, and likeness. But what name, image, and likeness means now is the players can get paid by doing commercials or selling their jerseys or that kind of thing. And where was I going with that? With name, image, and likeness now, it's people. People are giving money directly to fund getting a 7-foot player on the basketball team. But if the basketball team doesn't win, boy, there's going to be some hurt feelings there. And so the
Mhm.
first thing that I think is going to happen at college campuses is when I first started working at the University of Texas, El Paso, there were 12 people working in athletics that weren't the coaches. I mean, just the athletic director and the support staff and the academic. Now there's well over 100. And so this entire industry has sprung up on the back of these kids who at the time were not getting paid, but other people were getting a lifetime of financial security on the backs of these often black athletes that were only at the school for 4 years. And so I think that will be the first thing that will change. Is I think athletics departments will shrink because we want the money to go to the 7-footer, that kind of thing. And again,
Mhm.
I should also say, Rob, I'm part of the problem. I'm not part of the solution. I'm the television analyst for New Mexico State home games. And when I remember when Connie and I came home one night when we still had remember the answering machines where you push the button when you walk in the door to see
Yeah.
who called. And I pushed the button and it was an offer to do I get $250 a game. And I love doing it, but I pushed the button and it said, "Hey, we want you to be the color analyst for basketball and give us a call tomorrow." And I turned to Connie and I said, "Don't these people understand? This is why I walked away from college sports, is this crazy overemphasis." But then the next morning I woke up and I thought, I've gotten a lot of good stories out of this, and it's an area that I'm an expert in my field. It's an area I know pretty well. And so I'm like the alcoholic who keeps walking by the bar saying, is that Ralph and Mary in there?
Yeah.
I'm just going to go in and have one. I
Yeah.
cannot walk away from it. But I've also there's a big influence on my life was a man named David Megacy. In 1970, he quit pro football and wrote to work against the Vietnam War. And his book about it is called Out of Their League. And he told me, I've gotten to meet him and he's a real hero to me. And I mean, he wrote the book is about how sexist and violent and racist pro football was. But he said to me a long time ago, and I think this is true, is don't confuse the business side with the sort of the art side of things. Like
Mhm.
basketball, he said it's like the diamond business. Like, your spouse gives you a diamond ring and man, it's so beautiful. But behind that diamond ring, there's child labor, there's a destroyed environment, There's a lot of dead bodies behind your diamond ring. And it's the same with basketball. Once the game starts, it is a great game. I actually don't like football. I think I won't go into why I don't like it. It just seems militaristic and not as interesting to me. But to me, college basketball is still a beautiful game. Once the game starts, I still love it. But one of the things I've noticed since I've written the book is that, trying to find people who cover college football to recognize this book. And what I find is that most of the journalists are cheerleaders. Like, they don't want college football to be taken down a notch because it'll mean less people are reading them. And so I
Yeah.
would say 999 out of 1,000 articles about college football are just game reports, and no one is saying, what is it? Is it, help me, Ralph, who was it who said, the self-examined life is the only one worth living? Was that Emerson or somebody? I don't know. Might have been Michael Jordan. But just this idea that
With
no one,
Scottie Pippen, to
well,
be
yeah,
clear.
no one, very few people within the media are saying what's going on here, and where are we headed with this?
Yeah. Well, I mean, to kind of a couple comments, just to rewind to the very, very beginning when you were talking about um you, whatever, right? Like, say ExxonMobil has given so much money to, the University of Texas A&M's chemistry department, right? And so then there is nothing prohibiting a special interest from intervening on the American Academy. And it kind of calls to mind, I have a really brilliant colleague at SIU who was researching how the CIA was recruiting from the Yale English department during the Cold War,
Oh,
and
wow.
yeah, funding these conferences on, you guessed it, postmodern literature, or sorry,
Wow.
post-colonial. It was postmodern, yeah, but it was
All
like
right.
colonial literature. And so yeah, there's this huge investment in how the elite, like humanities, are talking about post-colonialism, are talking about that kind of writing, and that, so yeah, like it's something that's really worth thinking about, that like the university, it advertises itself as nonpartisan, or does it? But it really isn't. And the other thing, so about this kind of gets to part two of my question. You're talking, right, about like the ballooning of college athletics as a moneymaker, essentially. But I think you also made this like really amazing distinction, which I think is extremely important, between the giant, kind of oh God, how do I even put it? This is just, I'm thinking of like the movie Akira, that giant like flesh nodule, that this almost like tumorous presence on a campus, that it is both deadly, right? Because it's sucking up all the resources, and it is what's keeping us afloat, right? It's a kind of a disaster. So you have the distinction between that phenomenon, right, and the beauty of the game, right, and the beauty of, say, basketball, which I
Yeah.
agree, I think is a very beautiful game. And so I'm wondering, in your opinion, Professor Coach, what do you think, like, sports, college sports and professional athletics, what is it a proxy for? Like, when Americans watch sports, right? And a lot of different people watch a lot of different sports. But what does it do for us? Like, culturally, artistically, create, like, what does it do for you? What do you think?
Well, I think at the heart of it for society is it's sort of our city state against your city state. You know what
Right.
I mean? Like, you
Yeah.
might like I know this. You might decide I don't like Alice Munro anymore because of the revelations about her past. Was a whole different topic. I don't want to get into that. But you're not going to say I'm no longer a Chicago Bears fan. I'm switching to the Green Bay Packers.
Right.
It's our city state against their city state. And in some ways, like the original Olympic model, I think that can be very helpful. And I think in some ways it's replaced religion.
Mhm.
Chomsky's very against, Noam Chomsky's very against sports. What he says, I don't want to be misquoting or even acting like I'm any expert on Chomsky, but he talks about, if you go tune in the sports radio show tonight, and people have this incredibly nuanced understanding about the statistics and all the intricacies of the game, and who the backup quarterback is for the Dallas Cowboys, and that kind of thing. But they couldn't tell you who their governor is or their senator. And what Chomsky says is it blinds us to what's really going on in society. Yet, it's always sports at the forefront of American social change. So when I look at my own father fought in World War II, and I remember seeing the
Oh.
photos for the first, or paying attention to the photos for the first time when I was in high school, and I was asked them like, "Well, how come there's no, I was going to von Steuben where it's maybe 20% black or something. And I remember asking him, well, where are the black guys? Well, there were no black guys. We were fighting Hitler with
Mm.
segregated troops. Think about that, like fighting Hitler with segregated troops. So the U.S. military, the American military desegregated in 1949. Well,
Mhm.
Major League Baseball was 2 years before that. Jackie Robinson was 1947.
Wow, that's
And
right.
that happens all the time. Like Muhammad Ali, there was something like 300 conscientious objectors to the Vietnam War. And then when Muhammad Ali did it, the next year there was 30,000. I mean, these guys can be these
Yeah.
outspoken an outspoken athlete can be very dangerous. And there was no one more dangerous than Muhammad Ali, who was a complicated guy. But it's always sports, whether it was Martina Navratilova or
Mm.
John Amici, the first NBA player to come out as gay. It's always sports as at the forefront of social change. I
Mm.
worked at I worked at UTEP for 8 years, and UTEP was then called Texas Western in 1966. When they won the championship, it was the first team to have 5 black players and win the national championship, and they beat a team that Kentucky had never had a black player.
Wow.
So that landmark, it was like the Edmund Pettus Bridge, it was Selma Bridge of college sports. Well, at that time, Texas Western, which is on the Mexican border, had never had a black professor. So here they are winning the national championship with 5 black players, and there's not a black professor on the entire campus. But the
Mm.
next year they did. And so it's always sports is always at the so in some ways you can see I have a complicated relationship with sports, and I should not talk bad about her, and then she wouldn't talk bad about me. But I have a complicated relationship with sports. But it's always sports at the forefront of social change. So there's that. But I also want to say something else you said earlier that I did want to say. This is I think our American universities have this sort of reputation of being this sort of lefty, this sort of lefty mecca where, you have to be a radical in order to be a professor. And I think there's an element of truth to that. I'm going to guess it at our English department, which is now dwindled down to something like 14 people. I'm sure there's only one person who votes Republican.
Mm.
One. Okay, so there's that 13 out of 14 would not vote Republican, but I think it's sort of this false lefty bit, or they wouldn't be, because you've got professors making if they're making $100,000 a year, and then the adjunct professor is making $20,000 a year. Like, what kind of lefty system is that? That's not a lefty system. That's like capitalism gone wild. And so what I find is that there's sort of this pretend. So I remember being at the faculty meeting where someone had brought up the idea that we should let the instructors and the adjuncts vote on department policy, not just the elite professors. There's 14 professors, but there's something like 200 adjuncts and instructors, college instructors and part-time instructors, and that let's let them all vote on hiring. Oh no, we couldn't do that. The professors said we had to, they're not ready, they're not really ready to vote yet. And I just thought, I've really studied the civil rights movement and partly, and we'll talk about the American left movement in a little while, but I've studied the civil rights movement pretty closely, and that was always an excuse in the 1950s. Like, black people just they're not quite ready to vote. They're not quite ready. We don't want to rush into this, like treat them like equals. And I have found that, in my view, I mean, look what's happening if you come out against, like I think what's going on in Gaza and Israel is very complicated, and I think
Mm.
it's possible to have a different view, like not. But if you come out with a different view, boy, you really get shunned, and that's happened for it. It happened with the Vietnam War in the 90s. If you came out against the Vietnam War, you would get ostracized. Our great playwright at New Mexico State, really the godfather of the entire creative side of New Mexico State, was Mark Medoff. Do you remember the movie Children of a Lesser God?
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah, so he wrote that, and he wrote several novels. Became a famous playwright, and he walked away from stardom in Los Angeles and New York to stay at New Mexico. He had a chance to go on. He stayed at New Mexico State and taught for many years, but
Mm.
they denied him tenure in the English department because he was against the Vietnam War.
Whoa.
Far and away so I find this
Oh, that
whole
would be So actionable nowadays.
I find it sort of
Oh,
this pretend lefty thing. Like, yes, I'm for racial equality, but I don't want you to date my daughter. I think there's that kind of like, or I'm all for gay rights, but I don't want you anywhere near my child. That kind of thing. And I think a lot of what I find that a lot of it, and not just in academia, is a lot of it is performative. Like, we'll read a land acknowledgement, before an English department event, but we're going to underpay our adjuncts, and no one would say, no one would ever say, look, I'd be willing to give a part of my salary if it meant health insurance for our instructors. It's so, to me, it's a performative lefty, which to my ear, and we can get into the failures of the American left. To my ear, it's really performative, and it's all about image and that kind of thing. Sorry, I
well,
went off
let's
on a
that's
tangent.
okay because let's get into the hypocrisies of the academy and the American left. Let's do it. I think so. I'm actually just going to read this question because it's kind of a big one to give some context, but I think that very smartly, big time does almost this like Simpsons-esque kind of satirical move where it takes well-aimed pot shots at everyone. So it's not just the like terrifying Stalin-esque football coach and or the like Abu Ghraib situation that happens like as a result of Cardley's actions. That there's some really like scary kind of authoritarianism with the football coaches, but it's also like the heroes, right? And so we have this really lovable trio. We've got Eugene Mooney, who's kind of the heart and soul of the book, and he's this the divorce trapped by tenure history professor who just wants to be good, is still so embarrassed by kind of upsetting his high school's chapter of the Black Panthers back in the 70s. Very sweet guy. Braverman, who, what is the kind of the Che Guevara wannabe version of Mooney, really kind of skating by and is postponed tenure indefinitely. Um, and is also just like a chauvinist, but like, misogynistic towards women, but kind of, I feel it's silly to say this, right? But it's like he's less like like a disastrous, please, I need this person to leave the room, and more like that's my enthusiastic uncle. He doesn't understand things. We just need to discipline him in a
Yes.
kind way. And so, right, like figuring out how to manage Braverman. 'Cause he really grew on me too. I was like, oh, I like Braverman now. And he's the author of the self-published book, Hell No, We Won't Go, actually about Vietnam resistance and defectors. And of course, Layla Silliman, who we've already mentioned, who's the kind of like late 30s, hip young poetry professor. These two form like a really kind of a great triad, and they spend the book trying to figure out, hey, like, what do we do here? Braverman and Mooney want to lead this anti-football revolution. Layla's really scared because she, is just hired and doesn't have tenure. Um, and so I'm really curious about like, you know, how you conceive of fighting the good fight through each of these characters. What of yourself you see in each of these characters? Really, what is their like genesis? And then, more broadly, like, how is each kind of a stand-in for like, yes, right, like the American left. But I think also if we could really, really, really distill it down to, I think, a theme that would ramify really intensely for us today, even wanting to be good, wanting to do the right thing, wanting a genuine human desire to help other people. It's a really kind of a compelling set of themes. So I'm hoping that you can talk more about that.
Oh, geez. Okay, that's a big bite, but let me take a shot at it. I think Peter Braverman's the radical. Let's burn this motherfucker down. Kind of,
Yeah.
excuse me, but let's burn this place down. And
Yeah.
Eugene Mooney is let's no, we can work within the system. And I think I'm both of those people.
Mm.
When I was coaching back in my probably, let's see, 17 years total coaching, I got one technical foul. Technical fouls when you swear at the referee or yell at the referee. I
Yeah.
only got one. Like, I was pretty calm, and I do think there's an element of we can work within the system. But then also, I'd want to come home from these faculty meetings and bang my head against the wall, like when they start a committee to see how we can have fewer committees. And so I think I'm both of them. I'm the radical braver man. Let's burn. But so the moment. So I think probably both of those. And I wanted Layla somewhere in between. She's the new kid on campus, wondering like, what's the weird deal with this obsession with football? But there's a moment that I think about in American history, Ralph, and it was when Martin Luther King went to meet with, he wasn't the only one, but it was King went and met with Lyndon Johnson, with LBJ. And they wanted to push through the National Civil Rights Act. And can you imagine Martin Luther King comes to visit you, and what does LBJ do? He postpones him, he delays him. And he says, look, if I do it now, I can't do it now. And here's why I can't. And can you imagine telling Martin Luther King? But it turned out LBJ was right. Like what the timing of it, he got the timing of it. I know he was a complicated guy with Vietnam and everything, but the timing of what LBJ did to push through the National Civil Rights Act was really smartly done. And it had to do, there's this sort of idea, this happens in coaching all the time and parenting too, and probably with you teaching in the classroom, is when do I take a hard line, and when do I bend, and when do I put my foot on the gas, and when do I put my foot on the brake? And that sort of wisdom, I think LBJ understood. Like, but can you imagine saying to Martin Luther King, just be, we can't hurry through this. Like, I'm sure King thought he was being blown off, but LBJ had a plan. And so I think about this all the time: is when do we, when do we walk away and say, screw this, the system is broken. Like I love Bernie Sanders, but then the Democrats sort of screwed him around and pushed him out the door. But yet, well, Hillary's our first, she'd be our first woman president. She deserved it, and there's this sort of, when do I walk away and say, screw you, I'm starting my own political party kind of thing? And when do you keep working within the system? And so, like, I have great admiration for Barack Obama. I don't agree with everything he did, but I understand the complications. Like, you do what you can while you can do it. Try not to sell out, that kind of thing. So one of the things I think that I think that I've tried to capture in the book is these weird divisions in the American left. That if you're not as crazy committed as I am, if you're not going to burn down the president's office, then you're so the other moment in American history that really influenced me, and the book sort of mentions these guys a little bit, is there was something called the Students for a Democratic Society. Yes, this is all before I was too old enough to understand. But I grew up in Chicago. I was 10 when the 1968, or 9 when the 1968 Democratic Convention happened, and so I was very interested in, we talked about it in social studies and all that kind of thing. And there was this moment where the Students for a Democratic Society, it was students that ended the Vietnam War. It was student protests that ended the Vietnam War. But there was a moment where some of these guys like Mark Rudd and Bill Ayers and Bernadine Dorn said, this is not happening fast enough. We need to bring the war home. And they started the Weathermen, that changed their name to the Weather Underground. And they were going around blowing up post offices, and they blew up a Pentagon bathroom, and they wound up blowing up one of their own people at a townhouse in New York City. But and they tried to set off a bomb at a officers' dance in New Jersey, and I've gotten to be friends with Mark Rudd. He's a real hero to me, because to me, if you ask Mark Rudd about it, he says it still keeps me up at night, wondering what we could have done differently, because his view that they damaged the anti-war movement. And so what do we do for the women's rights movement? Like, do we blow up the president's office, or do we move slowly? And what? And so I was thinking about that quite a bit during the book. Is this idea of there's other people I did a book event in Chicago, and Bill Ayers was the moderator. He was he was on the FBI's most wanted list at one time, but he's like Mr. Campus Protests. And so I thought, because there's so many campus protests in my novel, I thought he'd be the perfect moderator for this book. And I'm friendly with Bill. I'm closer with Mark Rudd, but just this idea, Bill Ayers is completely unapologetic about what happened. And there's other people that were in the Weather Underground that said we were morons, we were idiots. And then there's Mark Rudd, who's in the middle, who says, I wonder what, well, to me, that's from a literary standpoint, not an ethical standpoint, but from a literary standpoint, that idea of what could we have done differently is, and even for this situation here, like, what is it that we do now with our American universities have become, entertainment centers for football and basketball. But by the way, I also had one other point I wanted to make, Ralph, is on the idea of making money. University of Illinois sports, football and basketball, are almost surely making money for the university. But at Southern Illinois, they're losing money. They are
Oh,
losing at Eastern Illinois, they're losing money. At Western Illinois, they're losing money. And it's all trying to keep up with Illinois, which of course can never happen. And so much of what we're talking about is there's sort of these it's like capitalism. Capitalism has been great for me, but it's not great for everybody,
yeah.
but so what am I going to do about it? Am I going to sell all my stocks and give them to the homeless in Las Cruces? Well, if I had real guts, I would do that. That's a very Christian idea. This idea that sell everything you have. Jesus said, he
Mhm.
used to play for the Chicago Bulls, I think. Jesus, he said, sell everything you have and give it to the poor.
Oh,
Well,
I remember his flu game. Man, he had a
yeah,
100-degree fever, but yeah, he was just dunking it up.
who's really doing that? Or the other, I was feeling bad from a minor sinus surgery I had the other day. And I was watching, so I watched the Pete Hegseth congressional hearings. And
Mhm.
he keeps sort of leaning on, well, it's because of my great faith in Jesus Christ, and that kind of thing. And I thought, well, somebody should raise their hand and ask, well, how do you square the idea of the U.S. military killing people and then your faith in Jesus, who said, turn the other cheek? Like, I think it's hard to
Oh,
really,
Russ, you can't ask that of the provost or of
yeah,
PX.
but, but it's, but it's,
You can't
but
raise
it's,
your hand.
I want to ask it about myself. Like, how do I walk the walk and not just put something on Facebook that, that feels performative to me? Do you know what I mean?
I think it is the question in so many ways, and I love how you grapple with it in big time. Like one thing that comes to mind, right? And I know we were talking a little bit about this is like a research fascination of mine right now is I'm so interested in, where authoritarianism like pops up at places you wouldn't expect it to, right? It's like, well, of course we think there's going to be an authoritarian regime in this like terrifying banana republic, whatever, like far afield from where we are now. But, in campus sports, right, you could see versions of authoritarianism in like adhering way too closely to the bylaws and to committee formation. It is a form of authoritarianism. It's self-discipline, right? And I think in the kind of the worst form. And so, what's always fascinating me about the Weather Underground is there's such a great example of like, okay, like obviously I am totally sympathetic and co-sign no Vietnam War, no war at all, of course, right? But there's such a fascinating example of like starting from a place where philosophically it makes perfect sense. And then they're blowing up their own members. They're blowing up,
Yes.
post offices. And it's interesting, Russ, because like so I was just such catnip for me, but I really loved I won't give too much away, but I really loved how you really went hard in the paint, to use a basketball turn of phrase, with making the university a kind of an Orwellian space, right? Including when Mooney and Braverman do get captured, right? What happens to Mooney? There is a kind of a deprogramming and a psyops, and it really does feel like maybe he's in North Korea, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, and
Yeah.
oh no, sorry, I was just gonna say, I didn't even interrupt you. I was just gonna say, it's so cool the way you show us how this, like, the authoritarianism of the right can crop up in that we associate with the right, right? Can crop up in such unusual places. And how can we, as individuals with humane goals, right? How can we stop ourselves from getting to those authoritarian places? That's all I was going to say. So I think maybe that's my next question: is how do you grapple with that in the book and yeah, in general?
Well, yeah, I want to go back to the idea that your college campus is some sort of lefty space. I don't think that's
Right.
true.
I don't think so either.
I don't know anything about your English department, but I will say that the person who's your department head is probably making 150,000 a year. But why is she making 150,000? Because she's good at organizing. Like to
Mm.
my ear, the dean should not make any more than the professors do. Like the fact that the dean is good at organizing things doesn't mean that he should make four times more than a faculty member. No, I don't think anyone will graduate from Southern Illinois University and say, the thing I'll always remember is that great dean of liberal arts that we had. They're going to remember the
But,
professors that they had. And
right.
so this idea, if it was really a lefty space, you wouldn't have a president making $800,000 a year, but most of the school being taught by adjunct instructors. That's not a lefty concept. That's a complete
It's a
capital.
corporation.
Yeah, that's a complete brutal corporate capitalistic way to run the. And so I've gotten where I think that it's crazy that the dean makes more than the fact that somebody who's good at committee work and good at organizing, yes, they should be the dean, but that's like that's not more difficult to do than to write a novel.
Sure. Yeah, sure.
And so to my ear, the universities, I think, are pretending to be lefty spaces, and I don't think they are at all.
Yeah. I no, I agree with that. And I mean, I think that like I think the way you have both, especially like Braverman and Mooney, they're so compelling because I'm not from their generation, right? But like, it's really still like their concerns feel really salient for me and members of my generation today. Like they're both wanting, even though Braverman can be kind of he can kind of be a bit of a blowhard about stuff, but I think beneath all of the kind of the postulating and the anger, I think like he's really wanting to do the right thing and to bring about good change. And so that
Yes,
is the question.
but even
Yeah,
even that gets complicated for Braverman, who's the radical big mouth radical. By
right.
the end of the book takes a twist at the end, and we all struggle with that. Like I can sit here and say that I'm a lefty and this and that, but geez, if I had a chance to make $1 million on on buying stock in Exxon or something like that, like it's hard to it's hard to walk away from that. It's hard to live a sort of a pure life. But what I was of course what I'm getting at in the book is the absurdity and the humor, and try to just and I'm sure it's the same with you, Raf, is that part of it was I had this idea of tearing down this football is king on campus, but what the book evolved to, I think, is sort of a skewering of academia more so than
Yeah.
more. I think that would be the revelation for a lot of people reading the book. Like we already know football's a big deal on campus, but we didn't know how the faculty was sort of how willing the faculty is to acquiesce.
Oh yeah. No, I mean, yeah, and this is kind of my last American left question, and I think it ties in with a lot of what you just brought up, but like you're really addressing, especially with the dilemma of, how do I lead a pure life, quote unquote, or a good or righteous life, a generous life. But also do it, where I'm kind of navigating all these different systems, right? I think that is a pretty profound and key question, I think, especially for your generation. And again, it ramifies for people from all different walks of life. And Braverman and Mooney they're baby boomers, right? And they bring the text. Oh my God, the it's just such a rich text, the way they're kind of talking about the civil rights movement, all these major protest movements of their kind of generational milieu. And so I was thinking, Russ, like, what are the ways in which you see the civil rights movement, right? How do you see it continuing? How do you see it stymied? Like, what do like, how do you see the Flower Children having given up on it? Was the Weather Underground being so militaristic or going in this authoritarian direction? How do you see that? Like, how do you see that? Let's put it that way. How does that
Well,
play?
I'm interested. I guess on a personal level, I'm interested in people. I think I've seen, you know, people, particularly on the American left, they're doing it as sort of a fashion thing. I think a lot of people that were involved in the Vietnam War protests, and they did not continue that. Like, even the Chicago Seven, I think it was Jerry Rubin became a stockbroker. And so
Right. Yeah.
whereas somebody like Tom Hayden or David Dellinger, it was a lifetime of working to make the world a better place. And you could argue was Mark Rudd more correct or Bill Ayers more correct than the Weather Underground guys. But to me, there's a difference between doing it as a fashion thing, in order to meet girls or whatever it is, and people that have committed a lifetime, like what Mark Rudd has done for many years now. He's in Albuquerque, but he's an organizer, and he's very much a work within the system guy now, despite his incredibly radical roots of taking over the Columbia University campus and that kind of thing. To my ear, though, we talked early in our podcast here about sports being the leader. And I think one of the last frontiers that I think sports is still struggling with is gay rights. And I know that as a player, as a coach and a player, the worst thing you could say is to your teammate or a player you're coaching is, well, you're playing like a faggot.
Right.
That kind of thing. That was the worst you could say to somebody. And I do think it's sort of the last, and I've grappled with that. I recruited a player named Tim Hardaway many years ago. He became a famous player, but near the end of his, let's see, he was already out of, yeah, he was already had retired when on a radio broadcast in Miami, he said they asked him, what would you think about having a gay teammate like John Amici had just come out as, I was gay my entire NBA career. And Hardaway said, well, I hate gay people. I don't think gay people should be around in the world. And he's since I've written about this at length because he's had he didn't have a press conference the next day to say, I was wrong. I made a mistake. I like gay people. It took him a few years. He worked on a gay suicide hotline in Miami, and got very involved. His best friend called him and said, "Don't you understand? Your goddaughter is gay. Did you not know? Did you not get the memo? That kind of thing." And I do think that people were able to get to Tim and have him see that how similar the American civil rights movement was to gay rights. But to me, it's sort of the last it's sort of the last frontier in sports is this, particularly on the male level, is are we going to accept, like there was the great boxer Emil Griffith who was gay, and people knew it. And they taunted him during fights, and he wound up being I think he was the world lightweight champion briefly. But there's a film about him that I haven't seen yet, which it's great. Isn't it great to recommend a film you haven't seen? But I do think that might be the last frontier. I don't know so much about women's sports because women's sports has always been more open, particularly in basketball, which would be where if I have an area of expertise in women's sports, it would be much more related. I'm not an expert in women's sports, but be much more related to basketball. But again, sports is always at the forefront of changing universities. But now it's going to be hard to get the athletes to say this time. This is one of the problems with the budget and paying players and that kind of thing is for years, it went on for years where the coaches were making millions and the players were getting room, board, tuition, and books. And it was because the labor force changed so quickly. Can you imagine if at Southern Illinois University, if they changed the entire English department every 4 years, like they do in basketball and football, you would never organize for workers' rights. And that's what was happening in college sports because the workforce changed so quickly. You could take a poor kid from Chicago and you think, wow, I get 6 new pairs of gym shoes a year and we're staying at fancy hotels. But then when I get to fly to Hawaii, but then when it's all said and done, what do I have to show for it? Where the coaches and the administrators have these incredibly lucrative careers. Well, that was what was delaying, in my view, that was what was delaying the change in college sports, is that the labor force kept changing. Was turning over so quickly that no one was looking at it while it was happening and saying, hey, this isn't fair. That you get these 19-year-olds that are delighted to get new shoes, and it doesn't occur to them that their coach has a lifetime of financial security.
Off their backs too. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
that's so.
But again, to get back to the novel, the only thing that I could think of to do was to make fun of it. And I did want to say this is that before I ever began writing the book, Rafa, I got the idea at New Mexico State. We have a class called Form and Technique in Fiction, and I thought I designed the class. This is back in 2012. This is maybe 2011. Before I ever started writing the novel, I taught a class called the Comic Novel because I
Mm,
knew I wanted to write about this. I had this idea to write a book with the beginning of the history professors selling popcorn which is how Big Time opens at the concession stand. And so I taught the class, in order to sort of think about it. And
sure.
when I started, and for years, it took me a decade to get this book published, as you know. And the entire time I was thinking, I got to get this thing done before they put college sports in perspective, and it would all be a meaningless book. Did you ever read White Noise by DeLillo? Yeah. So if you read White Noise before September 11th, the book
Right.
reads very differently. The airborne toxic event reads very differently after September 11th. Like, well, this has already happened. And so I was hoping, but thank goodness that the name, image, and likeness came through, and now college sports will never. I don't think, I don't think that I don't know that I have no solution. I'm not optimistic. I think it's only going to get worse. Or when I say worse, I think academics will be shoved in the background more and more until the whole
Well,
system collapses.
I mean, and then I know we don't have to have a hard and fast solution, but let's ponder. And to that effect, I'd like to switch gears and talk a little bit about you, Professor Coach Russ Bradburd. And just kind of like how how you went about writing this. So we're gonna get back to, I think, Mr. Blue Shirt inspiration and Red Shirt editor here. Um, so you join Russ with this book. You join a long and storied, pun intended, tradition of professors who are writing satirical campus novels well on campuses working as professors. And you came to this task not only with that background, but with, of course, the extensive coaching background as well. And so I am just like deeply interested in what from your life, right, ended up being research for this. I saw in the acknowledgments that you thanked Antonia Nelson. So I'm imagining that you spoke to more than a few colleagues about this as well. But yeah, tell us about your personal experience here.
Well, just I'm trying to think of how to answer this. Is it well, I think I've always been my favorite books when I was younger, and I still love Catcher in the Rye, which sort of begins at a prep school.
Hmm.
And one of my favorite books is that I think is an underrated book is A Separate Peace by John
Yeah,
Knowles.
that
Do you
is a
know?
good one. Mhm.
It's a beautiful book, and that's also a prep. Now I went to von Steuben. It's hardly a prep school. It's a Chicago public high school of 900 kids, but also A Separate Peace takes place at a prep school. And there's a Tobias Wolff novel called Old School. It's also a prep school book set in 1960. So I'm a sucker. I'm a sucker for, like you. I'm a sucker for books. But I was thinking about that, and I think it's actually more the ones that take place at more the ones that take place at high schools. But do you know Julie Schumacher? Do you know that name? I think she lives in Minneapolis, and I tried to get her to blurb the back of this book, and she was very polite about it, but she declined. She has a book called Dear Committee Member, and
Yeah, I've heard of that. I haven't read it, but I've heard of it. Yeah.
it's hilarious, and it's a very sort of mocking book about academia. So I love that book. And then there's the Rick. I haven't read everything by Rick Russo. I'm embarrassed to admit, but I love the book called Straight Man, and that's
Yeah, right.
mocking an English department. Everyone else says David Lodge, the British writer. I think David Lodge just died a few days ago. But
Whoa. David Lodge and David Lynch in a matter of days. That's
yeah,
intense.
yeah, you don't want to have DL as your initials, evidently.
Really
But
don't. No.
but I'm embarrassed to say I've never read David Lodge. I know he did Trading Places that became.
Yeah, well, yeah, I haven't actually, to be honest, I haven't really read much of his either. But yes, he did Trading Places, the two professors switch universities and wives.
Yeah.
But Russo actually had my old job at SIU and
I didn't
wrote.
know. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, he came back to SIU to visit. It was surreal. But yeah, Straight Man was really heavily influenced by SIU and then I think a college in Pennsylvania he taught at.
Oh, maybe so. But and then the other books I remember, I'm trying to remember what I taught that semester to start thinking about a comic strategy. Catch 22, of course. Then Eudora Welty's The Ponder Heart,
Mm.
which is, just a wacky kind of Southern kind of wacky
Oh,
book.
yeah, she's so I love her stories.
Oh, and Pym by Matt Johnson, which is sort of is sort
Oh,
of it's based. It's a
not read.
uh, this African American professor gets sort of shoved out of academia and winds up going on this trip, searching for. It's related to Edgar Allan Poe's novel. And anyway, I think Matt Johnson is really brilliant. He's an African American novelist. I think maybe he lives in Oregon now, but he also was a good high school basketball player. But there's different comic strategies, and I think the strategy I settled on was this idea that the people in the novel would not think it was funny, but the people within the what do you call it? There's a word for it. World, in the world building, the world that I've built. I never use that phrase world building, but I think everybody uses it now in teaching. But I was trying to build this world where everyone within the world would take it seriously, but everyone looking at it from the outside would think it was
Goodness.
funny and ridiculous. And so
Yeah.
that's a comic strategy. But then the other comic strategy that I leaned on is a couple of them is that I love the Marx Brothers, and,
Me
and
too. I was
and they're,
thinking of Duck Soup when I read this, Russ. I was thinking of Duck Soup so much.
yes, with
Yeah.
where they've got the football team, and they've
Oh,
what the Marx Brothers are constantly doing, and they're not the only ones to do this, is sticking the thumb in. They're like I mean, Trump plays on this, is we're going to stick our thumb in the eye of the elites, even though, of course, he's an elite himself. But this sort of sticking, like making fun of the elites, well, the Three Stooges do it as well. They're constantly mocking the stuffy people, but nobody does it more than Groucho does. But and maybe the biggest influence on me as a writer. I only started thinking about this recently, but when I was a kid, Mike Royko was the Chicago columnist, and you're probably not old enough to know Mike Royko, but your dad would. But Royko was a columnist for the Chicago Daily News and then the Sun Times and the Tribune. He actually quit. Let me think. He quit the Sun Times when Rupert Murdoch bought it, and he said, "I would never. No self-respecting fish would let himself be wrapped up in a newspaper that Rupert Murdoch owned." And this is back when no one knew who Rupert Murdoch, or I didn't know who Rupert Murdoch was. But what Royko was always sticking his thumb in Mayor Daley, the first Mayor Daley mostly, but he was constantly sticking his thumb in the eye of the Democratic machine in Chicago, mocking them for being, I mean, it was, of course, much more of a Republican regime than it was a Democratic regime in terms of philosophy. But Royko was very funny and very irreverent. And I think he wound up making a lot of enemies. I will say, Rafa, there's people that I gave this to a couple academics to read, and they were offended by the book. And they did not like this is as a manuscript, that they thought that, that these are people that have made their life on committee work and getting a grant and getting a course release, and, and really reaching the height of academia, making a full professor's salary while everyone else is, making an instructor's salary. And if you're in love with academia, you won't like, the book, I think would hope would make you squirm. So
Yeah.
anyway, those were the comic strategy. I taught that class and started thinking about it before I ever wrote a word. I taught the class, and I just thought, because I wanted to sort of familiarize myself with, how comedy works and what different ways to think about, about going about it. So I wanted it to, one of the things that sports provides for all of us, I wanted it to take place during one school year. And so the book essentially takes place, I think the last chapter might be the beginning of the second. So yeah, the last chapter is the beginning of the second school year. But one of the things that sports does for us as writers that I think is very helpful is each game can be seen as a story. I think that's part of our attraction to sports is here's a short story to watch. It's a 2-hour basketball game is a story in itself. Or a coach's career can be seen as a story. Or Muhammad Ali fights George Foreman in the great film When We Were Kings. It's one single event becomes the focus of the entire film. Well, that's one of the things that sports does for us is that there's a built-in story with every, and for me, in retrospect, I didn't think this then, but I'm not so was never so much interested in the X and O's of basketball, but I could tell you a lot of great stories, and to me
Yes.
that was always part of it. It's this there's stories behind the sports. I'm completely disinterested in sports writing, but I'll peruse through ESPN.com to think, oh, this guy got in trouble for hitting his wife. To me, that's a more interesting story is how the NFL is dealing with domestic violence than whether the Bears are going to beat the Green Bay Packers.
Oh God, wow, I agree with you so much on that one. Okay, final question. And I want you to you're gonna have your guru moment now. You're going to have your
Oh,
thought leader moment, your influencer.
this is a surprise question, I can tell.
Yeah, it is. Um, but it's something that you'll like have fun answering. How is coaching like teaching?
Oh,
How are they alike and how are they different?
yeah. Well, I think I found myself in the classroom. I had two of the best teachers that have ever walked the face of the earth. You mentioned Antonia Nelson and
Mhm.
Robert Boswell. They're a
That's
married
right.
couple. So I was lucky enough to meet Boswell, which is how I got interested in taking creative writing classes in the first place. But in the classroom, I find myself thinking more about Don Haskins and Lou Henson, the famous coaches that I worked for, about when to, that I think you want the kids to have the illusion that everyone's being treated equally, but of course you don't treat everyone equally, but you pretend that you do. And so I think there's that illusion, and and when to give them a motivational pep talk and say, "Geez, Ralph, you're such a talent, you can do this," and when to say, "Ralph, this is bullshit. This is not your best work at all. Like this is, I can tell you haven't done the work on this. Like you're not listening. that kind of thing. And so that kind of, but the workshop is very similar to the basketball team in that in
Yes.
general, the average workshop size was about 10 people, and the average basketball team size was about 13 kids.
Mhm.
And so there is that kind of similarity. And I've also found this is not avoiding the question, but it's similar to me as a writer as it was as a player. I find more similarities to
Mhm.
me as a player and as a writer. In basketball, you go to play in the pickup game at the park and you realize like everybody can dribble with their left hand except me. I'm going to go home and practice that some more. So you practice by yourself and then you bring the product back to the group, which is what you do in a writing workshop. You
Right.
you you write by yourself, you give it to the group and you realize, okay, I've got some problems. I've got to go back to the drawing board. Well, that basketball is one of the only sports you can practice alone. Like you can't practice baseball alone. You can't practice football alone. You can't practice volleyball. Maybe there's little things you can do like weightlifting or whatever, but basketball is one of the few where you can take your ball and go get better.
Yep.
There's most sports you can't, team sports, you cannot practice alone. And I find that's the thing that I find myself doing as a writer all the time is, well, now it's not so much a group. I have a friend named Barry Pierce whose book, The Plan of Chicago, is finally coming out. A book of short stories comes out in about 6 months. But what I found myself doing was practice, writing by yourself, go to the group and let the group, and then, but you've got to be fairly, if you get discouraged and think, oh, I can't make a layup, you can quit and walk away, or you can go back and sort of go back to the drawing board. So it's that constant go back to the drawing board kind of feeling that the workshop, uh, I think, presents to students, and that I think players have to buy into. Like, look, I'm showing you on the film that your 3-pointer is not very good, blah, blah, blah. You're only making 10% of your 3-pointers. And it's the same, I think the same sort of strategy works as a coach. But yeah, I found myself thinking about Don Haskins and Lou Henson as huge. When I was coaching, I was thinking about Robert Boswell and Antonia Nelson. And when I was writing, I was thinking about, when I
Absolutely.
was teaching, I was
Oh,
thinking
I
about
love
Don
it.
Haskins and Lou Henson. So it's the world upside down. It reminds me of the children's joke. If your nose runs and your feet smell, you're built upside down.
I love that.
A cute one,
No,
isn't it?
it's one thing that comes to mind with the workshop, is like it's also the case that if you're like the entire workshop assumes the responsibility for helping the individual writer, player, whatever, become better. Just like the team, right? It's like okay, to be a team player is to be like, hey, yeah, he's having a hard time with his layups. He's gonna go back home. He's gonna practice, yada yada, right? But also, like, we do need to work together to win the game. Like, we're not just gonna stand here inertly while he like tries to get this 3-pointer, and like we're gonna try and like help him after that, like play with the rest of the game, and so he can get into the position to have more of these opportunities. And so, I mean, that's what I feel like. That's why I feel like good teaching and good coaching are so similar is you're not only giving that amazing expertise to the kids, but you're also saying, and by the way, you are all responsible for helping each other be your best.
I think that's very true. Is that you've got to get the players to put their selfishness behind them for the good of the team, and the
Yeah.
workshop doesn't work if one person only cares about their own writing and doesn't care about the group. Is it's through like if I would imagine when the come down came out that some of your colleagues or what would you call it, your peers from the workshop might have been a little bit jealous. Like, how did she get a New York book contract? That kind of thing. But really it's sort of that rising tide raises all boats idea. Like just because your book came out doesn't mean my book can't come out.
Oh yeah,
People
I had to learn that too. I
yeah,
had
yeah.
to learn it myself. Yeah.
But in a way, the selfish interest thing, it's like controlled capitalism. Like in a way, the selfish interest thing is good too. Like you should be a little bit jealous of who I can't think of who you were in class with, but you should be a little bit jealous of that. Like, hey, I can do that. Like in a way, that's good to see somebody's success and be a little bit jealous and think, that in a way it should make you believe in yourself. Now you can turn on the system and say, what a corrupt system. Ralph Frumpkin got her Ralph Frumpkin got her confidence got taken by Ralph Frumpkin. You can be a little bit, but in a way, it can be a motivator. I mean, it's just like just like a lot of things, it can be a double-edged sword. So I do think, but I think that's very true, and I actually hadn't thought of it that way. But the workshop doesn't work unless there's teamwork. Like if you're not interested in teamwork, you shouldn't go to an MFA program. For
Yep.
me, I'm like the poster boy for how good an MFA, how much benefit an MFA. I understand the complications that an MFA is not for everybody, but I was starting at zero. I'd never had a college English class. I was a
Mm,
big reader, but I never took an English class in college. I took those. I don't know if they had them when you were in college. It's called a CLEP test. It was like college level examination placement or something. So I CLEPed out of English and fine arts. And what I should have thought, oh, I'm good at those. Maybe I would like a higher level, but instead I thought,
right.
oh, good. I remember thinking, oh, good, I don't have to take English ever again. That
Ooh.
was a pretty immature. I was 17 when I started college, but that was a very immature response. And and I think that yeah, I think that but I was coming at it as an outsider. The MFA program was my point, and the MFA program was hugely beneficial to me. But by the time that I retired last June, as you know, and I will for a long time I felt like I was learning more than the students. And then the last couple of years, I got not that I got bored with it, but I kind of felt like, God, aren't these kids ever going to get it? And I remember Don Haskins saying to me, I said that to ask Coach Haskins that, and he stopped me and he said, no, Russ, they're never going to get it. They're always going to be 20-year-olds. And so while you're getting smarter every year, they're always going to be 20. But
Well,
I will
yes.
admit, I lost patience my last year or two. I lost a little bit of patience with the students, and that's a good time to retire.
That's a time. Oh man, thank you, Russ, for this amazing conversation, the lovely humility vis-a-vis retirement and teaching. I think if we could have, or if I could, if you would allow me, permit me to pick a slogan for big time,
Okay, go
it
ahead.
would not only would it be there's no I in team, it would be there is no zero-sum game. There's
Ah,
no
interesting.
zero-sum game. There's no such thing as a zero-sum game. One of us lifts up and that lifts up the rest of us too. And so I think like, you know, what I really, really, really love about this book is that like, even though you've got these super greedy, violent, terrifying coaches, right? And all these corporate interests, at the end of the day, the reader learns along with, I think, Braverman, Mooney, and Layla that like if one of us succeeds, right, these revolutionary movements, these social movements, the rest of us do as well. And so that's a
Well,
great message.
thank you for that. And I hope to see you in the fall. We hope to get you here to New Mexico in the fall to read from your new book. Congratulations on your success. And thanks for you might have been the only perfect audience for this book just because you're as exasperated by academia as I am.
Oh, and that means it's time for me to stop the recording before I say too much. Let me
That's
pause it. But yes, I am more than a little exasperated.